Well, you've seen them. You've heard them. They sit down in the middle of the store or parking lot or even the middle of the road with traffic coming and they scream their head off. I mean, they freak you out. They're not going to stop until they get what they want. Now, most of the time they are 4-year-olds in Walmart throwing a tantrum because they want Cocoa Puffs, not Cheerios. But not always. Today, I want to talk to you about what might justifiably be called our tantrum culture and how we should respond. Hi, I'm Doug Newton, pastor for 45 years, national award-winning magazine editor, and author of 24 books. And this is At the Intersection with Doug Newton, where scripture, culture, and character meet. And I'm here to help you pursue the kind of character needed to align with scripture faithfully and to engage culture graciously. Now, each week, I make one observation about our culture. I give one insight from the Bible that speaks to that issue, and I suggest one way to strengthen the character that you and I need to relate to our mixed-up world with exemplary grace and fresh impact. And this is a no-gripe zone. Our question is not what's wrong with our culture. It's about what's the right way to respond. So you ready? Here we go. So what is a tantrum? I mean, do we really need to define it? You're in Walmart, you can hear the little kid screaming his head off from halfway across the store. And then if you have the misfortune of being in the same aisle when the tantrum explodes, you'll probably see something like a kid sitting or lying on the floor, flailing away and completely unashamed and unembarrassed, unlike his mom, as he screams. You know, it's funny how parents react differently to tantrums. Some just keep ignoring him as he, does his thing, and they keep scanning the ingredients of Cheerios that the kid does not want mommy to buy. Some stoop down to reason with him. Jimmy, Cheerios are good for you. They're better than Cocoa Puffs. Some scream back as they put a vice grip on his arm and drag him along behind the cart, and some quickly put back the Cheerios, recognizing their terrible mistake, and they reach for another option, hoping to select the one that will make him stop screaming. Some try the old walk away, another version of the ignore method, but with the built-in threat, you can just stay there and scream all you want. I'll be back when you're out of college. It's one of the mysteries of human existence. How do you handle a tantrum? You solve that mystery, you'll probably get a well-deserved Nobel Peace Prize, right? Tantrums, we got to fix the problem. Somebody, please. One dictionary defines tantrums as uncontrolled outbursts of anger and frustration. I'm not sure they're really uncontrolled. I mean, little Poopsie knows exactly when to fire one off to try to get what he wants. One medical encyclopedia puts it this way: temper tantrums are unpleasant, and disruptive behaviors or emotional outbursts. They often occur in response to unmet needs or desires. Tantrums are more likely to occur in younger children or others who cannot express their needs or control their emotions when they are frustrated. These experts also say tantrums usually begin in children 12 to 18 months old, and they get worse between ages 2 and 3, and then decrease until age 4. After age 4, they rarely occur. I take issue with that last statement. After age 4, they rarely occur. I mean, tantrums don't actually stop. They mature. Kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen it before, Maslow's hierarchy of moral development, where there are stages of development of moral character, moral qualities, and so forth. So I took that what's often seen as a pyramid and applied it to the issue of tantrums. And so here's what I've come up with: this hierarchy of tantrums. First, they start out as kicking and screaming. But then they rise to higher, more sophisticated levels. The next level up from kicking and screaming is the softer but no less annoying, unceasing why. Why do I have to eat Cheerios? Well, because Cheerios are good for you. Why? Oh, because they have healthy ingredients. Why? Because they're made with whole wheat and don't have as much sugar, which is not good for you. Why? Well, because, and this goes on as long as necessary for the parent to get worn down enough to finally say, all right, all right, all right, I'll just get you the Cocoa Puffs, but just this time. And of course, little Jimmy smiles. There's a reason why the word why and the word whine sound so much alike. But that technique only works a handful of times, really. And so Jimmy has to mature. And the tantrums, these I'm going to get what I want techniques, morph into the wordless, soundless, young teen facial and bodily language called moping. This is dreaded moping. Now, initially, the parent defies this kind of stealth tantrum. I mean, you can mope around the house as long as you want, but you're not going to get a BB gun. No way. But then it becomes like the classic staring contest. Who's going to blink first? And young teens usually win. I mean, they don't feel, concerned at all about, feeling connected with their parents, as much as the parents want to feel connected to their children. And so the parent blinks and buys the BB gun just to stop the moping and feel like Jimmy loves them again. And from there, the tantrums rise to a higher level of moral development until the tantrums find their power and expression in affinity groups and the power of disruptive protest, boycotts, demonstrations. And that's what we see in our culture today. I remember the first time Margie and I traveled to San Francisco maybe 20 years ago now. We were staying for a few days in a hotel, and so we watched the local news before bedtime, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, coming from the Midwest, our nightly local news was sadly a video journal of the day's car accidents or house fires or shootings occasionally, and unnecessarily long weather reports because, why spend 10 minutes on weather when you're going to still have to look out the window in the morning to see what it's really going to be? But in San Francisco, the nightly news reported on the scene of one protest after another after another. That's what the whole newscast was about. Now, we saw that the very first night, and it proved not to be an anomaly because the next night it was the same thing again, and then the next and the next. I mean, were there no car accidents in San Francisco? No house fires? No shootings? Probably, but this was a city, as we came to understand, and a region overrun with protests way back then. But guess what has happened since then? The protest culture moved into America's heartlands. And so today, my own city's nightly news seems preoccupied with protests these days as well. There are destructive marches for peace. Ironic. There are sit-down strikes in the middle of interstate highways. There are mobs of parents taking over school board meetings because they want to oust the school board president. It's especially troubling when the camera and microphones are jammed in the face of children and you hear language of defiance, idioms of the protest mindset. We need to rise up and take back our school to make it safe for everyone, and we won't rest until the school superintendent resigns. Okay, and this is coming from a 6th grader? Where did he pick up that language? Now, please bear in mind, you see this behavior among groups of all political persuasions. So answer me this. How is that any different than a tantrum? We will sit down right where we are and shout until we get what we want. We will use disruptive behavior. We will make the circumstances so uncomfortable that you, whoever the you is, will finally do what we want. All tantrums are protests. But now, don't get me wrong. not all protests are tantrums. And so the question I'm going to talk about in a minute, in the spirit of this podcast, is how do you keep a protest from becoming a tantrum? But first, just in case you're thinking, well, Doug, you may be mistaken in assuming there's been such a dramatic increase in protests. Well, actually, do you realize that many studies concur that there's been a dramatic increase in the last 15 years? One study called An Analysis of World Protests from 2006 to 2020 documented 2,809 major protests worldwide, and most of them, 2,449, from middle-income and high-income countries like the United States. I mean, those are the kind of protests that make the national news. And in North America, there is one major protest every 2 days. And that's not even counting local and regional protests where speakers are shouted down in political venues or academic venues or school board meetings or outside someone's home. How many of these protests are justifiable is not my purpose in this podcast. I am merely pointing out the mounting habit of turning to the protest reactionary method to force action in the face of perceived wrongs. Now, no doubt, there are many times when the protest method may be the only way to come against the systemic forms of oppression to force change. But again, I ask, how is a protest different than a tantrum when its method is disruption? Raising a ruckus has become a knee-jerk reaction to address problems, to express opposition, to force change. And if this is the case, and it is even in Christian circles where the protests may seem less disruptive, a little bit more passive, circulating emails behind a leader's back or petitions in the background or circumventing protocols, doing an end run, backbiting social media attacks, but they're no less destructive to the spiritual health of churches. If this is the case, then let's remind ourselves of a few ethical standards for any form of protest that should align with our peacemaking Lord. See, Jesus is very concerned about how we use power and force. So how do you keep a protest from becoming a tantrum? If you follow these 6 ethical standards, I think that'll help as you use your right to protest. So here are 6 ethical standards. First, you have the right to protest only if you know what you're talking about. I don't know how many times I see people come in to interview people at protests and they put a microphone in front of their face and they ask them questions, and the people who are answering the questions don't even know for sure what the issues are and can't articulate them. So the question is, before you protest, do you know the facts? Do you know what you're talking about? Can you know what you're talking about? Should you know what you're talking about? Sometimes certain information can't be known at all, or at least right away. It's true that people in power can stonewall, but even then, your task is still to get the information you need before you draw hard and fast conclusions. And if you can't get that information, then you really don't have a right to take a firm position until you know for sure. Second ethical standard, you have a right to protest only if you are allowing the opposition to make their case. Shouting down the opposition, do you realize shouting down the opposition so they can't be heard is no different than stuffing a gag down a person's throat? It's not right. Here's a third ethical standard. You have the right to protest only if you are causing no harm in the process. So you have to ask the question, are you harming the opposition's reputation through your are you harming, in the case of Christians, are you harming the church's reputation if you're putting up some kind of a, very localized protest in some way in the background in a church situation? Are you harming people caught in the crossfire? This is so crucial. Sometimes harm comes to innocent bystanders in the midst of these protests. The thing that almost throws me into tantrum when I watch some protests on TV are the times protesters close down major thoroughfares and interstates. And I wonder, and I actually assume that in any large city, there will always be someone on a major road or highway who desperately needs to get where they're going, like maybe to a hospital, or, think of a person who's been out of work for a half a year and they've got this final critical job interview, an appointment for that, and there they are stuck. And their only route was blocked by the protest. Do you realize, from an ethical standpoint, if someone dies en route to a hospital because they couldn't get there in time for life-saving procedures, then that entire protest group, as a group, is no less guilty of cruelty than a person who selfishly leaves a child in a locked car in summer heat just to have less distracted time to shop and do what they want. Protests usually hurt bystanders in some way. I wonder how many young people over the years have rejected the church because of their disgust over the petty infighting that they are privy to in the churches that they've attended. Here's the next standard. You have the right to protest only if you are not making false accusations about the opposition's actions, beliefs, or motives. That's one of the most common things that we do about the opposition. We are always making false assumptions and false accusations about where they're coming from, what they actually believe, or what their reason is for doing what they're doing. And I've said it before on this podcast and other situations, we never have the right to claim what somebody else's motives are unless that motive is claimed by the person themselves or somehow clearly represented in what they're doing. Otherwise, we have no right to make a false accusation about motives. Do you know that today one of the most virulent pockets of intolerance and prejudice is found, ironically, among those protesting against prejudice and intolerance? I am an old white male, 70 years old. Consequently, just by virtue of my identity as an old white male, I am the target class of most protests. If I were also rich, I would be everything nearly everybody blames for everything wrong, an old, rich, white guy. Deep beneath the surface of most protesting in this tantrum culture are the cynical assumptions that all people with power act to preserve their power. All people with power act to preserve their power, and that all people with power are to blame for everything that's going wrong. That's prejudice, that's bigotry. Another standard, you have the right to protest only if you are prepared to accept the consequences of civil disobedience. You see, there are actually laws about how we assemble when we assemble. We have the right to assemble, but it can't be an unlawful assembly. At all costs, we together in our society must be committed to common law, to a social contract, whether we've had any say in what that contract is or not. We will be governed by laws. It's got to be a decision. It's got to be a willful, voluntary decision that we will be governed by laws. Now, we can rewrite the laws to be more just. We can protest against laws that are not just. And maybe we've had no say in writing those laws, but until they are changed, we must remain subject to those laws and will accept the consequences if we violate those laws in order to make our protest. That's the way it used to be. Protests, people protested, they protested vigorously, strongly, but they understood that there would be consequences and they were willing to accept those consequences. That's the only way protesting preserves the general peace and tranquility of our union. Now, I've got one more ethical standard for protesters, but first, this is a good place for me to insert a guideline from the Bible. There's nothing wrong, and many times there's everything right when Christians join protests to call out and correct injustice and evil wherever it occurs. But we must always be a voice within that protest, speaking up for protesting in the right way. The ethical standards that I've been talking about, you see, flow from a source that combines two scriptures. Ephesians 4:15, speak the truth in love, and Hebrews 12:14, make every effort to live in peace with all people. You realize that every phrase in those two verses are equally crucial. Speak the truth, meaning is everything you're saying or shouting accurate? Is it verified? Is it the whole story? Are you seeing, hearing, understanding, and accepting the whole story? Speak the truth in love. In love. Love means that you're wanting the best for every person and nothing harmful to happen to anyone. That's what love is. Speak the truth in love. Make every effort. Make every effort. I mean, you may not be able to control the opposition's actions and reactions, but have you tried your best to minimize conflict? Finally, live in peace. Make every effort to live in, or not finally, live in peace. No animosity, working for reconciliation, making the first move, then with all people, including the ill-behaved or the bigoted in your estimation, or the unfair people who are part of that group you see as the worst people on earth. I mean, these two verses alone will keep protests from turning into tantrums. But there is one other ethical standard for protesting that a Christian must uphold personally and attempt to influence at the group level, at least within Christian circles. What is it? You have a right to protest. And again, this is only for Christians. And don't expect it for others. I'm not saying it's a standard for everyone. We can't expect it to be, but here's what it is. You have a right to protest only if you have spent more time in prayer than in protest. Okay? Only if you spent more time in prayer than in protest. Ultimately, according to the Word of God, we are not wrestling against flesh and blood, right? Behind the scenes is an invisible spiritual realm animating all evil in the world, always. And those schemes and those efforts and that power comes from the forces of demonic power. You seek power over those powers is the first priority. Point your protest in that direction in prayer before, during, and after any protesting you take up against social injustices in the realm of flesh and blood. Now, I would never speak against the right of Americans to protest, to freely and forcefully speak truth to power when injustice and inequality overshadow our self-proclaimed land of opportunity. But we must be careful not to get caught in the current of the disruptive protest movements around us that too often block the rights and well-being of others, even as we're wanting to assert our own. So, I've prepared another crosswalk, something that you can download for free as a self-check in areas that you may want to, where you may be prone to tantrum reactions. In this crosswalk, you're going to be able to review the 6 ethical standards that I've spoken of for making sure a protest that you might be involved in doesn't devolve into a tantrum. And to check your own possible tendency toward kind of passive protesting. And then finally, I am going to share a couple of very challenging verses that I haven't used in this podcast from Paul's letter to Titus about our relationship to authorities and governments. This is so challenging. Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceful and considerate, and to show true humility toward all people. And Paul was writing that in a context where there was no democracy. There was no right to free speech and freedom of assembly. And yet he set that standard. That's challenging. And this crosswalk is going to take you through that. When you begin to really understand this, you realize that what needs to ramp up in all of our lives is respect, for one, humility, integrity, for another. And, so that I've written these exercises in character development for some of these different character traits like integrity and respect, and those are available, but you might want to check those out. Well, that's it for this week. I am so glad that you were here, and I hope you'll agree. This is important stuff. Now, I'm not sure why the camera's on my side shot. Hang on. I'm going to put it back to face on. There we go. Here I am again. Okay. Now, if you think this podcast is important, I'll have a permanent version on YouTube and an audio version for those who want to listen on the go, and you can let people know that there is that audio version. All the information about the podcast, past and future, can be found on our website. All the links can be found at the end of this video. And if you think this podcast is a valuable resource and hope it will continue, would you leave me a comment or send me an email? Well, I hope you see the importance of this podcast and that you'll join me again next week at the intersection with Doug Newton. I'm already looking forward to addressing the fact that our culture seems to be fueled by fear these days. And I can't wait. In the meantime, remember, let's live our lives and express disagreement without ever the mildest or socially acceptable forms of tantrums. See you then.